The Capitol Hill Showdown, when a former Secret Service agent unmasked the truth. Ilhan Omar had just made what would become known as the most catastrophic mistake of her political career. She, a prominent member of Congress, stood on live national television during a highly anticipated congressional hearing and, with an almost theatrical flourish, branded a former Secret Service agent a racist cop. It was a brazen, calculated attack designed to shut down dissent and weaponize identity politics, a tactic she had wielded successfully against countless critics before. But this time, her target was not a typical political pundit or a cowed opponent. Her target was Dan Bongino. Bongino's response, delivered with a chilling calm that belied the fury building beneath, would echo through the halls of power and across the nation. "Congresswoman, shall we discuss your marriages, all three of them?" What happened next would not merely damage, it would end her career forever. This wasn't just a political squabble, it was a devastating takedown, a systematic exposure meticulously executed by a former NYPD officer and Secret Service agent who had protected presidents. He was about to unleash documented evidence that would shock America to its core. Ilhan Omar, much like Ocasio-Cortez before her, had walked into that hearing room with an aura of untouchability. She believed her identity, as a Muslim, a woman of color, and a refugee, would serve as an impenetrable shield against scrutiny. She genuinely thought that by labeling her critics racist or Islamophobic, the evidence against her would simply vanish, dismissed by a complicit media and a fearful political establishment. She was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. When you attack someone who has spent 12 years investigating fraud at the highest levels of government, someone trained to meticulously gather and present undeniable evidence, you had better be ready for a war of facts, not rhetoric. This was bigger than any political scandal America had witnessed in decades. This was the day the nation discovered that one of its most protected, celebrated politicians had allegedly been running a sophisticated, multifaceted fraud operation for over a decade. It was a Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., and the Rayburn House office building was about to become the epicenter of a seismic shift in American politics. The House Judiciary Committee had convened for what was ostensibly a routine hearing on border security, but the electric tension crackling through the air suggested otherwise. It was about to become one of the most watched, most impactful congressional hearings in American history. Dan Bongino sat at the witness table, a picture of unflappable calm, the composure of a man who had spent decades in federal law enforcement. A former NYPD officer and 12-year veteran of the Secret Service, tasked with protecting presidents, he was not a man who could be intimidated by political theatrics or rhetorical bluster. He had been invited to testify on border security, a topic well within his extensive federal law enforcement background. As he began his opening statement, his distinctive New York accent, familiar to millions of working-class Americans, resonated clearly through the room. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me today," Bongino began, his tone professional and measured. "My testimony draws on 12 years of federal law enforcement experience, including investigations into human trafficking and fraud operations that exploit our immigration system." He had spoken for perhaps 90 seconds, setting the stage for his testimony, when Congresswoman Ilhan Omar interrupted sharply, her voice aggressive and laced with a practiced indignation. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman," she cut in. Omar had become adept at manufacturing viral moments, at positioning herself as a victim while simultaneously launching venomous attacks on her opponents. "I question whether this witness should even be allowed to testify before this committee," Omar declared, her voice rising with a performative fury. "Mr. Bongino is nothing more than a right-wing conspiracy theorist with a documented history of Islamophobic rhetoric." The room erupted in murmurs and gasps, but Omar pressed forward undeterred. "This man," she continued, her finger jabbing across the room at Bongino, "is just another racist ex-cop who's built an entire career on xenophobia. He doesn't belong in this hearing room."
The accusation hung in the air, thick with outrage and calculated provocation. Omar had just called a former Secret Service agent, a man who had literally put his life on the line for the country, a racist, to his face on live national television. It was a nuclear option, a violation of congressional decorum that went far beyond typical political sparring, and it represented a catastrophic miscalculation. The camera zoomed in on Bongino's face, anticipating an angry, explosive response, the kind of response Omar typically provoked and relished. But what they captured instead was something far more unnerving, far more dangerous, a slight, chilling smile. It was the kind of expression that appears when someone's opponent has just, without realizing it, walked directly into a meticulously prepared, inescapable trap. Dan Bongino sat perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds, letting Omar's words hang in the air, letting the cameras capture her triumphant, self-satisfied smirk. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the broadcast equipment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried throughout the chamber with an absolute, unnerving authority. Congresswoman Omar, let me respond to your accusations directly, since you've chosen to make this personal. He reached down beside his chair and withdrew a thick, heavy folder mirroring his earlier move with Ocasio-Cortez. It landed on the table with a resonant thump that echoed in the silent room, every camera instantly fixating on its ominous presence. You called me a racist, Bongino continued, his voice taking on the methodical, almost clinical tone of a detective presenting irrefutable evidence. Let me establish some facts about my background before we discuss your record, Congresswoman. He held up his official Secret Service credentials, encased in plastic. I spent 12 years protecting President Obama, our nation's first black president, with my life. I stood post outside the Oval Office. Does that sound like a racist to you? The question was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through Omar's rhetoric like a surgeon's scalpel. Omar's confident, aggressive expression flickered, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face. But since you've decided to question my credibility on national television, Bongino pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. Let me ask you some questions, Congresswoman Omar. The folder opened wider, revealing hundreds of pages of documents, neatly tabbed and highlighted. Shall we discuss your marriages, all 3 of them? Or shall we start with the campaign finance violations, the $250,000 fine, the $2.8 million paid to your husband's consulting firm, the allegations of immigration fraud you've never addressed with evidence? Each question landed like a bomb, meticulously aimed and devastatingly effective. Ilhan Omar's expression transformed from righteous indignation to something approaching sheer, unadulterated panic.
The unraveling. Omar's marriages and immigration fraud exposed. Chairman Jordan, his face reflecting a deep understanding that something monumental and potentially career-ending was unfolding, intervened. The chair will grant Mr. Bongino additional time to respond to the Congresswoman's charges. Mr. Bongino, please proceed. Bongino's slight smile widened as he looked directly at Omar, a predator's gaze meeting its cornered prey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people deserve to hear some facts, some uncomfortable facts about Congresswoman Omar's record. He extracted the first set of documents from his folder, official marriage certificates. Congresswoman Omar, Bongino began, his tone methodical and precise, like a detective laying out a timeline. According to public records, you entered into a religious marriage with Ahmed Hirsi in 2002. You subsequently had 3 children with him. Then, in 2009, you legally married a different man, Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi. He paused, letting the significance of the 2 different names sink in. But here's the profound problem, Congresswoman. While you were legally married to Mr. Elmi from 2009 to 2017, official records indicate you continued living with Mr. Hirsi. You filed joint tax returns with Mr. Hirsi. You had more children with Mr. Hirsi. He looked up, his gaze piercing. That, Congresswoman, is tax fraud.
Filing joint tax returns with someone while legally married to a different person is a federal crime. The room fell into an absolute stunned silence. The sheer audacity of the alleged actions now being presented with official documentation was almost too much to comprehend. But the real question, Bongino pressed on, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its authority, is who exactly is Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, and why did you marry him? He didn't wait for a response. Multiple investigative journalists, who for years were dismissed and deplatformed by the media, have presented compelling evidence suggesting that Ahmed Elmi is in fact your biological brother. Bongino continued, his tone unwavering. The evidence includes consistent statements from the Somali community, school records showing shared familial connections, social media posts you subsequently deleted, and clear immigration patterns strongly suggesting you married him to facilitate his student loans and, critically, his U.S. citizenship. Omar looked utterly frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. Now, Congresswoman, you've consistently dismissed these grave allegations as baseless conspiracy theories, but you have never provided a shred of credible evidence to refute them. You have never submitted to a DNA test. You have never explained the conflicting timeline of your marriages. You have never clarified why you filed joint tax returns with one man while legally married to a different person. In my 12 years as a federal agent, I learned that innocent people provide evidence to clear their names. Guilty people attack their accusers and deflect. Your response, Congresswoman, follows the guilty person's playbook exactly. He then produced an official letter, holding it up for the cameras. But we don't have to rely solely on these historical allegations. In June 2020, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, an official state authority, officially fined you $250,000 for using campaign funds for personal expenses, including specifically documented travel to meet Ahmed Elmi in London. He paused for dramatic effect. The official finding was devastating. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was confirmed misconduct by state authorities, resulting in one of the largest penalties in Minnesota history. So let me summarize, Congresswoman. You allegedly married your biological brother for immigration fraud, you filed fraudulent tax returns, you demonstrably used campaign money for personal expenses. And when legitimately questioned, your only defense is to attack people as bigots or Islamophobes. Bongino sat back slightly, a cold, unyielding resolve in his eyes. Now you're welcome to respond with evidence. Release your tax returns, agree to DNA testing, explain the timeline. If you're innocent, Congresswoman, prove it. Omar's response was halting, her voice barely a whisper, filled with a desperate defensiveness. These are false allegations that have been debunked. By whom? Bongino shot back, cutting her off instantly. Name one actual investigation by a reputable, independent body that examined the documents. Name one news organization that actually investigated these documents and found them false. The silence, Congresswoman, is damning. And that, Bongino said, with a cold, almost predatory smile, is just the immigration fraud. Shall we discuss the $2.8 million you've paid to your husband's consulting firm? The committee room atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as a routine hearing had become a systematic, chilling criminal prosecution playing out live on national television.
The campaign finance conundrum, millions to Omar's husband's firm. Dan Bongino reached for a new, even thicker folder, bulging with Federal Election Commission reports and other financial analyses. His demeanor remained professionally calm, a stark contrast to the explosive nature of what he had already revealed. Congresswoman Omar, he began, his voice devoid of emotion. Let's move to something more recent, more easily documented, and frankly, equally egregious. Your systematic, alleged theft of campaign funds through massive payments to your husband's consulting firm, the E Street Group. He arranged FEC documents with the precision of a forensic accountant. When citizens generously donate to political campaigns, they are contributing to support election efforts and promote political causes, not to personally enrich candidates or their family members. Federal law is crystal clear. Candidates are explicitly forbidden from using campaign money for personal expenses. That, Congresswoman, is federal embezzlement. Bongino displayed a damning timeline. In 2018, your campaign began making payments to the E Street Group, a consulting firm owned by Tim Minett. Initial payments were relatively modest, $60,000, then $85,000. But then, Congresswoman, something profoundly changed in 2019. The payments exploded. In the first quarter, the firm received $230,000. The second quarter saw $420,000. By the third quarter, an astronomical $680,000 was transferred. Bongino looked up, his gaze fixing on Omar. What, Congresswoman, do you suppose changed so dramatically? He didn't wait for her to answer. Your relationship with Tim Minett became romantic. Bongino then produced official divorce documents. In August 2019, Tim Minett's wife filed for divorce, specifically alleging in her court filing that her husband was having an affair with you, Congresswoman. Here's the direct quote from the filing. Defendant's travel and work hours now appear more related to his affair with Ilhan Omar than actual work. He paused, letting the weight of sworn testimony hang in the air. So we have sworn testimony that by April 2019, you were engaged in an affair, and miraculously, payments to his firm doubled. He continued, relentless in his presentation of the timeline. By the end of 2019, a staggering $1.9 million had been paid to the E Street Group. In 2020, another $900,000. In March 2020, you divorced Ahmed Hirsi, your longtime partner. Later that same year, you officially married Tim Minett, the consultant whose firm had by then received millions. The progression of events was devastatingly clear and chronological. Affair begins, payments to his firm explode. Omar divorces, marries the consultant. The total amount paid from your campaign to Tim Minett's consulting firm from 2018 to 2024, Congresswoman? A staggering $2.8 million. Bongino let that figure sink in, its immensity echoing in the silent room.
For that astronomical sum of money, Bongino pressed, his voice dripping with irony, Tim Minett should have delivered the most innovative, groundbreaking campaign in political history. So let's look at what you actually got for $2.8 million. He displayed social media analytics. Your social media presence is unremarkable, indistinguishable from thousands of other politicians. Your campaign website is a standard template design, likely worth no more than $10,000. Your digital advertising expenditure was minimal. So, Congresswoman, what exactly did you pay $2.8 million for? He displayed invoice summaries from the E Street Group. These invoices, Congresswoman, consistently list vague services, digital consulting, strategic communications, travel coordination. They are deliberately vague because they are clearly disguising personal payments as legitimate business expenses. But we have compelling evidence showing where a significant portion of that money actually went. He outlined 3 categories. Category 1, personal travel. Over $200,000 billed as consulting travel, but investigative journalists and public records tracked the actual trips. Luxury vacations to California, opulent getaways to Miami, exclusive Martha's Vineyard weekends. This, Congresswoman, is you using donor money for romantic trips with Tim Minett. Category 2, personal legal expenses, over $500,000 billed as strategic communications, but actually paid to your personal lawyers defending you against immigration fraud allegations you still refuse to address, and handling your divorce proceedings. Category 3, living expenses, rent, groceries, dry cleaning, car payments, furniture, clothing, all billed as campaign expenses and funneled through Minett's firm. Bongino's voice hardened, becoming a cold, unwavering accusation. This, Congresswoman, is systematic theft. You treated your campaign as a personal bank account, funded by unsuspecting donors.
Then he pulled out his most devastating piece of evidence, an official finding from the state of Minnesota. But we don't have to rely solely on my investigation. On June 4, 2020, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, an official state authority, investigated and officially sanctioned you for precisely these violations. Let me read their findings. The board finds that Representative Omar used campaign funds to pay for personal travel, personal legal expenses, and improperly reported expenditures to obscure the personal nature of spending. They fined you $250,000, one of the largest penalties in Minnesota history. And how did you respond? You paid the fine with more campaign money, another violation, and never admitted wrongdoing. In fact, you continued the exact same practices, paying Minot's firm another $700,000 in 2023 and 2024, even after being caught and fined. Bongino leaned forward, his voice a hammer blow. This, Congresswoman, is grand theft and embezzlement, federal crimes carrying up to 20 years in prison. Chairman Jordan turned to Omar, his expression grave. Congresswoman, do you wish to respond? Omar's voice was defensive, strained. These were legitimate business expenses reviewed by the FEC. The FEC didn't review them, Bongino interrupted her, cutting her off instantly and sharply. Minnesota investigated and fined you. The FEC is notoriously understaffed and slow to act, but I am calling for a federal criminal investigation right now. He gathered his papers, his gaze unwavering. That's the campaign finance fraud, Congresswoman, but we're not done. Let's discuss your anti-Semitism, your foreign policy betrayals, and your sympathy for terrorists. If the previous revelations about fraud had been devastating, what Dan Bongino was about to present next cut to something even darker, a pattern of deep-seated hatred toward Jews, consistent sympathy for America's enemies, and foreign policy positions that consistently undermined U.S. national interests and security.
Terror ties, foreign funds, and systemic fraud. The grand finale. Congresswoman, Dan Bongino began, his voice now imbued with the authority of a former federal agent, deeply versed in counter-terrorism. Let's meticulously discuss your relationship with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. His law enforcement background lent immense weight to his words. As a former Secret Service agent with extensive counter-terrorism experience, I am intimately familiar with CARE's documented history. Founded in 1994, CARE was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing case in U.S. history. Furthermore, the FBI officially cut ties with CARE in 2009 due to serious concerns about its documented connections to Hamas, a designated foreign terrorist organization. He displayed official FBI reports and court documents. Yet, Congresswoman, you maintain remarkably close ties with CARE. You were a community organizer with them before your political career. You speak frequently and prominently at their events. You openly coordinate policy positions. You share staff members and extensive donor networks. Why, Congresswoman, do you maintain such deeply intertwined ties with an organization that the FBI, our nation's premier law enforcement agency, refuses to work with due to terrorism concerns? Bongino didn't wait for an answer, moving swiftly to the next damning category of evidence. Now let's turn our attention to your fundraising activities, he declared, producing detailed financial analysis reports. There are serious, documented questions about the infiltration of foreign money into your campaigns, in direct violation of federal law. Federal law unequivocally prohibits foreign contributions to campaigns, but there are sophisticated ways around it, typically through domestic intermediaries known as straw donors. Your campaign, Congresswoman, exhibits highly unusual and deeply suspicious patterns. He laid out specific examples. In 2019, you received $50,000 from 50 individual donors, all giving precisely $1,000, all on the exact same date, from addresses that later proved to be non-existent or fake. This, Congresswoman, is a classic straw donor scheme, a textbook method where foreign money is laundered and funneled through fake American donors to obscure its illicit origin.
He continued, stacking more evidence. You have received substantial speaking fees from Islamic Relief USA, an organization with documented Hamas connections, as confirmed by Israeli and American intelligence reports. The timing of these payments, I should note, consistently corresponds with key votes affecting Middle East policy in Congress. Furthermore, you received an unusually large book advance from a publisher with foreign ownership. Your first book had minimal sales, yet you received a disproportionately huge advance, a potential money laundering vehicle for illicit foreign payments. Bongino meticulously laid out the forensic analysis. I have used Secret Service financial investigation techniques to analyze your campaign contributions. The patterns reveal unmistakable geographic clustering, timing coordination, and amount standardization that are irrefutable indicators of organized straw donor schemes and foreign money laundering. This, Congresswoman, is precisely what federal investigators are trained to look for in campaign finance fraud cases involving foreign money. He produced one final crushing document. But we don't need to speculate about these patterns, Congresswoman, because you've already been caught. In 2020, Minnesota authorities officially found that you violated campaign finance law by accepting contributions through illegal bundling schemes. You were fined for this, Congresswoman, just as you were fined for personal use of funds, just as you were fined for tax violations related to your marriages. There is a deeply disturbing, systematic pattern here of repeated, brazen law-breaking. Omar's attempt at defense was weak, her voice barely audible. These donations were reviewed and approved. Reviewed by whom? Bongino demanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. The FEC, which is notoriously understaffed and years behind on investigations, or the Minnesota board that actually investigated and fined you? He gathered the documents, a mountain of undeniable proof. Here's what the overwhelming evidence shows, Congresswoman. You maintain ties with terror-connected organizations. You demonstrably receive money through suspicious channels that strongly suggest illicit foreign influence. You have been repeatedly sanctioned and fined for campaign finance violations. And when caught, you never admit wrongdoing. You simply pay the fines and brazenly continue the exact same practices. That, Congresswoman, is not the behavior of someone who made honest mistakes. That is the behavior of someone who fundamentally believes she is above the law. Dan Bongino then pulled out his final folder. This one contained evidence that would tie together all the previous disparate revelations into a comprehensive, horrifying picture of systemic corruption allegedly rooted in Omar's Minneapolis political base. The foundation of fraud, voter and welfare scams. Congresswoman Omar, Dan Bongino began, his voice now taking on a grave, almost sorrowful tone. Let's talk about how you actually got elected. Because your meteoric rise to power, your narrative of grassroots organizing was not, according to documented evidence, a story of pure democratic triumph. It was instead built upon what appears to be a corrupt political machine, systematically exploiting voter fraud and large-scale welfare scams. He displayed a series of investigative reports and printouts from leaked undercover footage. We have footage, Congresswoman, of cash being exchanged for ballots. We have community organizers, your campaign workers, caught on camera coordinating these operations, collecting hundreds of ballots from single addresses, filling them out, and delivering them en masse. Bongino showed the evidence methodically. We have voter registration records from key precincts show over.
The veil lifts. Anti-Semitism, foreign allegiances, and terror sympathies. Congresswoman Omar, Dan Bongino began, his voice now imbued with the tone of grave moral authority that silenced any limbering murmurs in the room. As a former Secret Service agent, I protected Jewish Americans. I investigated real terrorist threats that targeted innocent lives. Your rhetoric isn't just offensive, Congresswoman. It is profoundly dangerous.
It fuels hatred, endangers communities, and undermines the very fabric of our nation. He opened a new, thick folder, its contents hinting at the dark depths he was about to expose. Let's meticulously document your disturbing pattern of anti-Semitic statements and actions. He laid out a chronological series of damning exhibits. February 2019, you tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins," when discussing pro-Israel political support. This, Congresswoman, is a direct invocation of the age-old, hateful anti-Semitic trope that Jewish people secretly buy political influence with money. The House of Representatives, your own chamber, passed a bipartisan resolution specifically condemning your remarks. He continued without pause. March 2019, you publicly suggested American Jews harbor allegiance to a foreign country. This is the classic dual loyalty trope, historically used to question whether Jewish Americans can be loyal to their own nation. Again, this provoked widespread condemnation even from within your own party. April 2019. Speaking about 9/11, you famously uttered, "Some people did something," minimizing the worst terrorist attack on American soil, an act of unconscionable barbarity that claimed nearly 3,000 innocent American lives. The terrorists, Congresswoman, were not some people. They were al-Qaeda jihadists who murdered our fellow citizens. Bongino's voice rose, now edged with a controlled, righteous anger. These are not isolated mistakes. This is not a series of unfortunate misstatements. This is a consistent, documented pattern of minimizing terrorism, attacking the nation of Israel, and deploying deeply anti-Semitic language. But it gets demonstrably worse when we examine your foreign policy positions and alleged foreign allegiances, he stated, producing a speech transcript. In 2023, you told a Somali-American audience, and I quote directly from the transcript, "We are people who know they are Somalis first, Muslims second." Congresswoman, you are an elected American congresswoman, yet you publicly declared your primary identity, your primary loyalty is to Somalia, not America. You took an oath to the U.S. Constitution to defend this nation, but you publicly declared your primary loyalty is to a foreign country. Bongino then displayed voting records. Let's scrutinize your voting record on foreign policy. You consistently vote against sanctions on Turkey, despite President Erdogan's egregious human rights abuses and his increasingly hostile posture toward U.S. interests. You oppose crucial support for Israel, a vital American ally. You have sided with Venezuela's authoritarian Maduro regime. You consistently vote against measures designed to counter Iranian aggression, a regime that actively sponsors global terrorism. The pattern, Congresswoman, is chillingly clear. You consistently support America's enemies and oppose our allies. He pulled out more documentation, including old news reports. In 2013, you described al-Qaeda saying, "When you say al-Qaeda, people get upset, but when you say America, nobody says anything." You literally compared al-Qaeda terrorists who killed 3,000 Americans favorably to America. Regarding al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group that has brutally killed American soldiers and perpetrated countless atrocities, you have been notably reluctant to condemn them unequivocally. Why, Congresswoman? Is it because of that Somali-first identity that you've said comes before your American identity? Bongino's expression hardened with undisguised disgust. As a former federal agent who spent years investigating terrorism, you, Congresswoman, represent a profound counterintelligence concern. You exhibit undeniable foreign allegiances. You consistently support hostile regimes. You minimize the barbarity of terrorism. Yet you have access to classified intelligence.
Our closest intelligence allies, British MI6, Israeli Mossad, have, according to classified reports I have reviewed, expressed serious concerns about sharing sensitive information with Congress due to members like you who cannot be fully trusted with national security secrets." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of the allegations sink into the stunned silence. "But what's most disturbing," Bongino continued, his voice heavy with condemnation, "is how you have been so consistently protected from accountability. When anyone dares to criticize these positions, your immediate reflex is to scream Islamophobia. The mainstream media, for years, has shielded you. Democratic leadership, despite internal misgivings, has publicly defended you. Speaker Pelosi infamously watered down House resolutions condemning your anti-Semitism, justifying it by claiming you had a different perspective. The squad circles the wagons, transforming legitimate criticism into bigotry." Bongino's voice cut like a knife. "You, Congresswoman, have weaponized your identity, your race, your religion, your refugee status, to create an impenetrable shield. This shield has protected you from the scrutiny any white Christian politician would face immediately and decisively." He leaned forward, his voice a final crushing blow. "But that protection, Congresswoman, ends today. The documented evidence of your anti-Semitism, your profound foreign allegiances, and your alarming sympathy for terrorists is now public in your own words and in your own actions." Chairman Jordan looked visibly troubled, his expression grim. Several Democratic committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces betraying the recognition that they could no longer defend the indefensible. Omar, her face a mask of panic, attempted a response, her voice strained and defensive. "These are deliberate distortions of my positions, taken out of context." "Out of context, Congresswoman? You said some people did something about 9/11. What context, Congresswoman, makes that acceptable? You said you're Somali first. What context changes that unambiguous meaning? What context justifies comparing America to Al-Qaeda?" Omar fell silent, her mouth opening and closing uselessly. "That's what I thought," Bongino said coldly. "Now let's discuss your documented connections to organizations with known terrorist ties and your highly suspicious fundraising from foreign sources." The hearing had now been going for nearly 3 hours, and the systematic destruction of Ilhan Omar's credibility showed no signs of slowing down. Each revelation had been more damaging than the last, and Dan Bongino clearly had even more damning evidence prepared.